The governess, moving through the marble hall of Ravenshollow Palace, had only 3 years prior danced in identical ballrooms, adorned in French silks and diamonds worth more than an entire village's annual income. Now, Lady Evangeline Ashford, though no one knew her by that name anymore, adjusted the folds of her plain gray wool dress, keeping her eyes cast down, as befitted a woman of her current station. Yet, when the butler announced the arrival of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow, something cold and deadly flickered in her green eyes for a fraction of a second, the sole remnant of the haughtiness that had once coursed through her aristocratic veins. The butler informed the imposing man descending the main staircase that Miss Catherine Winters had arrived the previous day from the Yorkshire Governess School and would oversee young Lady Margaret's education, as per his instructions. Duke Marcus Blackwood paused on the last step, his penetrating gaze assessing the new employee with the same coldness he might use to appraise a horse at market. At 42, he commanded a dominant presence, a reputation feared in the halls of Westminster and on the battlefields of politics alike. Evangeline forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny, though every fiber of her being urged her to lift her chin and face him as an equal. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice carrying the natural authority of one who had never been questioned. He expressed his trust that Miss Winters was aware of the high expectations of his household, emphasizing that Lady Margaret was his only daughter, and her education would not tolerate negligence. Evangeline executed a perfect curtsy, calculated to show sufficient respect without excessive subservience. She had practiced every movement for months in preparation. She assured His Grace of her experience with young ladies of the highest lineage and her complete understanding of the responsibilities entrusted to her. What she did not say, what she could never say, was that she knew the aristocracy's standards intimately because she had been born into its very heart. Lady Evangeline Ashford, the only daughter of the late Earl of Montclair, had been educated in those same gilded salons, spoke the same 4 languages she would now teach, and mastered all the arts a lady of quality should possess. There was also another piece of knowledge she guarded like a dagger against her heart. She knew precisely how this very man, Marcus Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had orchestrated her father's complete ruin through fabricated accusations of treason against the crown. The Duke, seemingly satisfied with her response, simply said, "Very well," and added that Mrs. Pemberton, the head governess, would show her to her accommodations and introduce her to Lady Margaret, expecting her to begin her duties that very day. As he walked away towards his private chambers, Evangeline allowed herself a moment to study the broad back of the man who had turned her life to ashes. Marcus Blackwood moved with the absolute confidence of someone who believed he had buried all his enemies, utterly unaware he had just welcomed the ghost of his greatest victory. Mrs. Pemberton, a robust woman in her 60s, gestured for Evangeline to follow her through the tapestry-lined corridors. She explained that her pupil, Lady Margaret, was 12 years old and could be quite challenging, noting that the last instructor had left after only 2 months, citing temperamental incompatibility. Evangeline acknowledged this, though her thoughts were far from the mischief of a spoiled child. Each step through the palace corridors was a journey through painful memories. She had frequented this very palace during the social season, when she was still the admired heiress of Montclair. She had waltzed in this same ballroom, laughed in these same gardens, and even innocently flirted with Marcus Blackwood himself, before he decided that destroying her family would better serve his political purposes. The plan Evangeline had meticulously crafted during 3 years of exile and preparation was as intricate as the tapestries adorning the walls. It would not be a violent or hasty revenge, as that would be unworthy of her lineage. It would be methodical, precise, and utterly devastating. She intended to destroy Marcus Blackwood's reputation in the same way he had destroyed her father's, through carefully planted evidence, strategic alliances, and the relentless exploitation of every weakness in his social armor. Mrs. Pemberton then indicated Lady Margaret was in the gardens, preferring to study outdoors, though she added that it was not always appropriate for a young lady. Evangeline observed through the glass a brown-haired girl sitting under a pergola, seemingly more interested in sketching the birds singing in the rose bushes than in any formal lesson. For a moment, an unexpected pang of emotion pierced her chest. The child was innocent of her father's machinations and would inevitably be harmed by what was to come. But 3 years of solitude, poverty, and humiliation had tempered Evangeline's heart, like steel forged in fire. Her father, the Earl of Montclair, had been an honorable man who dedicated his life to the crown's service, only to be falsely accused of conspiracy and die in the Tower prison before he could defend his honor. Marcus Blackwood had orchestrated every moment of that tragedy to consolidate his own political position, and now he would pay for it. Mrs. Pemberton, noticing Evangeline's hesitation, called her name, asking if something was bothering her. Evangeline instantly recomposed herself, returning to the perfect mask of a respectful governess. She assured Mrs. Pemberton that nothing was amiss, merely admiring the magnificent gardens. What she did not say was that these very gardens had witnessed her tears the night she learned of her father's imprisonment, that she had run among these same rose bushes in search of Marcus Blackwood, begging him to use his influence to help an innocent man, only to discover, too late, that he himself had forged the evidence against the Earl of Montclair. Now, 3 years later, Lady Evangeline Ashford had returned to settle that debt of blood, and Marcus Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had no idea that the instrument of his ruin had just crossed the threshold of his home. The initial weeks as governess revealed to Evangeline both the household routines and the most intimate secrets of the Blackwood family. Lady Margaret proved to be an intelligent and perceptive child, though clearly neglected by a father who saw her only as a responsibility to be managed. During French and history lessons, the girl often inquired about the world beyond the palace walls, demonstrating a curiosity that her restricted environment could not satisfy. The Duke himself maintained a rigorously structured routine. Evangeline observed that he received correspondence from London every morning, met with estate administrators in the afternoons, and dedicated his evenings to studying documents in his private library. He was a meticulous man, which explained how he had managed to orchestrate her father's ruin with such lethal precision. During one of these clandestine observations, Evangeline discovered something that made her heart race with dark possibilities. Marcus Blackwood kept a secret safe behind a family portrait in his library, and access required a combination he always entered in the same sequence. Through her privileged position as governess, she had access to nearby corridors during the hours the Duke worked, allowing her to observe his habits without arousing suspicion. The opportunity for deeper investigation arose when Marcus had to travel to London for parliamentary sessions. He would be away for 2 weeks, leaving the estate's administration to his trusted butler, and the supervision of Lady Margaret entirely to Evangeline. On the first night after the Duke's departure, Evangeline waited until all the servants had retired before venturing into the library. Her bare feet moved silently over the oriental rugs as she navigated among the shelves laden with leather-bound volumes. The light from her candle cast dancing shadows that seemed like specters of her past, reminding her of nights she had studied in equally grand libraries in her own ancestral home. The safe proved more accessible than she had expected. The combination she had observed Marcus use repeatedly, his late wife's birth date, opened the secret compartment without resistance. What she found inside surpassed her wildest expectations: correspondence that evidenced a network of corruption extending to the highest echelons of government. Among the documents, she discovered letters detailing how Marcus had fabricated evidence against her father in exchange for lucrative contracts for his properties and political support for his ambitions. Even more revealing, she found evidence that the Earl of Montclair had not been the only victim. At least 3 other nobles had suffered similar fates at Marcus Blackwood's hands, all of them convenient obstacles to his plans for ascent. But it was the discovery of a particular document that solidified her determination for revenge. A letter in her own teenage handwriting, the desperate plea she had sent to Marcus begging for mercy for her innocent father. He had kept it as a trophy, along with a handwritten note describing his satisfaction in refusing the request and proceeding with the planned destruction of the Ashford family. The calculated coldness of this revelation left Evangeline temporarily breathless. It had not simply been a political move. It had been cruelly personal. Marcus Blackwood had extracted pleasure from her family's destruction, savoring every moment of their despair. With trembling but determined hands, she copied the most incriminating documents, memorizing details that could be verified and confirmed by other sources. Her original plan for revenge, which she had considered perhaps excessively elaborate, now seemed inadequate in the face of the magnitude of the evil she had uncovered. When she returned to her quarters in the early hours of the morning, Evangeline had completely reformulated her strategy. She would not be content with merely ruining Marcus Blackwood's reputation. She would expose the entire network of corruption, ensuring he lost not only social status, but also his freedom. The same methods he had used against innocent nobles would be employed against him. But this time, the evidence would be genuine and devastating. The irony of her position did not escape her keen awareness. While Marcus Blackwood slept peacefully in London, believing he had buried all traces of his transgressions, the instrument of his ruin walked the very corridors he considered his safe domain. Lady Evangeline Ashford, hidden under the identity of Miss Catherine Winters, had become the ghost who would haunt every remaining moment of his privileged life. From that night on, every lesson with Lady Margaret, every silent meal with the servants, every stroll through the familiar gardens became part of a carefully orchestrated symphony of revenge. Marcus Blackwood would return to find his home exactly as he had left it, except for the invisible presence of justice that had finally arrived to collect a 3-year debt. Marcus Blackwood's return from London brought with it a restless energy that disturbed the palace's orderly routine. Evangeline immediately noticed a change in the Duke's demeanor, a tension in his shoulders, and a hardness in his eyes that suggested complications in his political affairs. During the formal dinner marking his return, he barely touched his food and dismissed the servants earlier than usual. Lady Margaret, sensitive to her father's moods, asked the governess if she had done something to displease him. Evangeline assured the child it was not her fault, but internally recognized that Marcus's unease could both favor and complicate her plans. A man under pressure would be more prone to making mistakes, but also more dangerous if he discovered threats to his security. The opportunity she had awaited arose 3 nights later, during a banquet hosted by the Duke to receive Lord Pemberton, an influential member of Parliament. Evangeline knew, from the documents she had discovered, that Pemberton was one of the collaborators in Marcus's corruption network, though he apparently ignored the full extent of the methods employed by the Duke. While supervising Lady Margaret during the children's dinner, Evangeline strategically positioned herself where she could observe the interaction between the two men. The conversation, conducted in low tones but audible to her trained ears, revealed that Marcus was facing parliamentary investigations into questionable contracts granted to his properties. Lord Pemberton expressed concern that certain irregularities were attracting unwanted attention from reformers within the government. Marcus responded with characteristic arrogance, assuring his visitor that he possessed sufficient guarantees against any serious investigation. He specifically mentioned having useful precedents for dealing with problematic nobles, a veiled reference to the methods he had employed against the Earl of Montclair and others. It was at this moment that Evangeline understood she needed to accelerate her plans. Marcus was not just facing external pressure. He was preparing to eliminate new obstacles using the same lethal methods he had employed against her father. If she did not act quickly, other innocent families would suffer the fate of the Ashfords. The following morning, after Lord Pemberton's departure, Evangeline made a decision that would irreversibly alter the course of events. During a drawing lesson with Lady Margaret in the gardens, she allowed the child to discover one of the copied letters she had, accidentally, dropped from her pedagogical materials. Lady Margaret, with the natural curiosity of an intelligent child, inquired about the document. Evangeline feigned surprise and quickly retrieved the paper, explaining they were personal notes on political history. However, she planted seeds of doubt by mentioning how fascinating it was that certain historical figures managed to manipulate accusations of treason to destroy political rivals. The child, unconsciously absorbing the information, asked innocent questions about such practices during dinner with her father that night. Marcus, already under strain from the parliamentary investigations, reacted with unusual irritation to his daughter's seemingly academic questions. His abrupt response about the need to protect the realm against traitors, whether real or fabricated, revealed more than he intended. Evangeline observed this interaction from the adjacent corridors, recognizing that she had successfully introduced the first element of instability into Marcus's psychological armor. The man who had destroyed her father through fabricated accusations was now being forced to publicly defend such practices, even if obliquely. But it was the following night that the true catalyst for Marcus's downfall manifested. A messenger arrived at the palace with urgent correspondence from London, and Evangeline managed to observe the Duke's reaction upon reading the news. His face visibly paled, and he immediately dismissed all the servants, locking himself in his private library. Through methods she had perfected during weeks of observation, Evangeline discovered the contents of the correspondence. The parliamentary investigations had uncovered irregularities in property records related to contracts Marcus had obtained after the ruin of the Earl of Montclair. Worse still, relatives of the other victims of his machinations were beginning to publicly question the circumstances of the accusations that had destroyed their kin. Marcus Blackwood, the man who had orchestrated the destruction of multiple noble families, now faced the prospect of his own practices being exposed. The irony of the situation did not escape Evangeline. The hunter was becoming the hunted, exactly as she had planned. That night, as the palace slept restlessly under the weight of the tension emanating from the Duke's chambers, Evangeline initiated the most dangerous phase of her revenge. She began planting additional evidence that would lead parliamentary investigators directly to the documents Marcus kept in his secret safe. The man who had destroyed her family through fabricated evidence was about to discover how it felt to be a victim of his own tactics. But this time, the evidence would be genuine, and the justice that had been denied to the Earl of Montclair would finally be served. The dynastic peace of Ravenshollow had ended forever, and Marcus Blackwood still did not understand that the architect of his ruin slept under his own roof. The period following the news from London transformed Ravenshollow into a silent battlefield where every movement carried political weight. Marcus Blackwood intensified his activities, receiving visitors at unusual hours and sending correspondence with feverish frequency. Evangeline recognized the signs of a man mobilizing his defenses, precisely as her own father had tried to do in the final moments before his imprisonment. Marcus's first strategic move became evident through a conversation Evangeline intercepted between him and his private lawyer, Sir Edmund Carstairs. The jurist had arrived discreetly through the palace's back entrance, avoiding the main gates where his presence might be noticed by observers. During their meeting in the library, they discussed methods to discredit the parliamentary investigations through the same network of influence Marcus had built over the years. Evangeline understood she was witnessing the exact tactics that had been employed against her father. Marcus planned to use his political influence to suppress evidence, intimidate witnesses, and, if necessary, fabricate counter-accusations against his investigators. It was a well-established pattern of behavior that had worked effectively in the past. However, this time Marcus faced an adversary who intimately knew his methods. Evangeline had spent 3 years studying not only his tactics, but also the weaknesses of his support network. Every political ally of Marcus possessed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Every favor he had granted created a debt that could be called in. The opportunity to implement her next maneuver arose when Marcus decided to host a social gathering to consolidate support among his local allies. The event would be presented as a seasonal celebration, but Evangeline recognized its true function: a show of strength intended to discourage future investigations by displaying his continued social influence. During the preparations for the gathering, Evangeline positioned herself to observe the guest list and understand the political dynamics Marcus intended to exploit. Among the names, she recognized several figures who had participated in the smear campaign against her father, as well as new allies Marcus had cultivated since then. But it was the discovery of a specific name on the list that provided Evangeline with her most powerful opportunity for revenge. Lord Harrison Ashford, a distant cousin of her father, and the current holder of a smaller estate, had been included among the guests. Marcus clearly intended to display the presence of an Ashford family member as evidence that reconciliation and forgiveness existed regarding past events. Lord Harrison, however, had always harbored private doubts about his cousin, the Earl of Montclair's culpability. Evangeline knew, through earlier correspondence, that he suspected manipulation in the evidence presented against his relative, though he had never possessed sufficient proof to publicly challenge the verdict. The strategy Evangeline conceived for this occasion required timing precision, comparable to a master chess player's moves. During the night of the gathering, while discreetly serving as a supervisor of domestic arrangements, a role her governess position allowed her to assume without raising suspicion, she would orchestrate a seemingly casual encounter between Lord Harrison and specific evidence of Marcus's culpability. The execution began during dinner, when Evangeline ensured Lord Harrison was seated close enough to the library to overhear fragments of a conversation she had carefully arranged. Using her knowledge of Marcus's schedule, she knew he would receive Sir Edmund Carstairs during a specific interval of the meal to discuss recent legal developments. The conversation, conducted in tones that seemed confidential but were audible to attentive ears, included specific references to the methods employed against the Earl of Montclair. Marcus, believing himself in a safe environment among allies, allowed himself to speak with unusual frankness about his past tactics, including details that only the true architect of the conspiracy could know. Lord Harrison, involuntarily absorbing these revelations, began to show visible signs of perturbation. Evangeline observed how his long-held suspicions transformed into growing certainty as the details accumulated. The man who had silently questioned his cousin's guilt was finally obtaining confirmation of his worst suspicions. The culmination of Evangeline's strategy came when she accidentally dropped one of the copied documents near where Lord Harrison had retired to get some fresh air in the gardens. The paper contained specific correspondence between Marcus and Sir Edmund, detailing how they had fabricated evidence against the Earl of Montclair, including references to witnesses who had been bribed to provide false testimony. When Lord Harrison discovered the document, Evangeline appeared moments later, feigning embarrassment at having lost important papers related to her historical studies. She explained she was researching cases of judicial injustice as part of her intellectual development, allowing him to retain the document long enough to fully absorb its content. Lord Harrison's reaction exceeded Evangeline's expectations. The man, confronted with definitive evidence of his cousin's innocence and Marcus Blackwood's culpability, made a decision that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the situation. Instead of confronting Marcus directly, he chose to discreetly leave the gathering with the document in his possession, clearly planning independent investigations. Evangeline knew she had set in motion forces Marcus could not control through his usual methods. Lord Harrison possessed independent political connections and sufficient resources to conduct investigations that would circumvent Marcus's network of influence. More importantly, he had a personal motivation to seek justice that transcended practical political considerations. As she watched the guests depart that night, Evangeline recognized that she had managed to turn Marcus's show of strength into his first real step towards ruin. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of multiple families through fabricated evidence now faced investigation by someone armed with genuine evidence of his culpability. The web of ancient politics was turning against its master weaver, and Marcus Blackwood still did not understand that every move he made to defend himself only accelerated his own destruction. The discovery that confidential documents had vanished from his private library struck Marcus Blackwood like a physical blow. Evangeline observed his reaction from the adjacent corridors when he realized the secret safe had been breached, its contents meticulously examined, and specific selections removed. The fury contorting his features revealed a man confronted for the first time with his own vulnerability. The internal investigation Marcus immediately ordered transformed Ravenshollow into a besieged fortress. Every servant was interrogated, every access to private quarters re-examined, and additional security measures were implemented. Evangeline remained outwardly calm during her own interrogation, expressing appropriate concern for His Grace's privacy violation, while providing a solid alibi based on her responsibilities with Lady Margaret. However, the true crisis emerged when Lord Harrison Ashford returned 3 days later, accompanied by an official parliamentary representative, and carrying evidence Marcus immediately recognized as coming from his personal files. The ensuing confrontation in the main library revealed to Evangeline, observing from her strategic position, the full extent of the desperation that now consumed the man who had destroyed her family. Marcus initially attempted to deny the authenticity of the documents, claiming they had been fabricated by political enemies. When this strategy failed in the face of the parliamentary representative's authentication expertise, he shifted to intimidation, reminding Lord Harrison of the consequences of challenging established figures in the political hierarchy. It was only when confronted with evidence that additional copies existed in secure locations that Marcus understood the futility of his usual methods. The dilemma he now faced transcended his previous experiences because, for the first time in his career, he was being attacked with his own weapons by adversaries who knew his methods intimately. Every tactic he attempted to employ was anticipated and neutralized. Every ally he tried to mobilize received information that compromised their own position should they choose to support him. Evangeline recognized the crucial moment when Marcus made the decision that would define not only his own fate, but the legacy of his entire title and position. Faced with the choice between accepting ruin with residual dignity or fighting through increasingly desperate and criminal methods, he chose the path he had always preferred: the complete destruction of his adversaries by any means necessary. The strategy Marcus implemented demonstrated both his capability and his moral depravity. Recognizing he could not suppress the evidence already in circulation, he decided to create an alternative narrative so devastating to his accusers that the truth would become irrelevant. He planned to accuse Lord Harrison of conspiring with foreign powers, use his influence to plant compromising evidence, and orchestrate a smear campaign that would destroy any credibility the genuine documents might possess. It was during the implementation of this strategy that Evangeline faced her own deepest moral dilemma. Observing Marcus prepare to destroy Lord Harrison using the exact same methods employed against her father, she understood there was a fundamental difference between seeking justice and perpetuating cycles of destruction. Her revenge was about to create new innocent victims, repeating the patterns she had sworn to destroy. The choice confronting Evangeline at that moment transcended personal considerations of revenge. She could allow Marcus to destroy Lord Harrison, ensuring her own identity remained protected, but perpetuating the injustice that had motivated her original quest for justice. Alternatively, she could intervene directly, revealing her true identity and risking not only her personal safety, but also the effectiveness of all the plans she had meticulously constructed. The decision came when she intercepted correspondence detailing how Marcus planned to use Lady Margaret as a tool in his campaign against Lord Harrison. The child would be instructed to testify about suspicious behavior she had observed, becoming an unwitting accomplice in the destruction of an innocent man. This violation of childhood innocence, echoing how her own childhood had been destroyed by Marcus's actions, crystallized Evangeline's determination. That night, for the first time in months, Lady Evangeline Ashford fully emerged from the mask of Miss Catherine Winters. Donning the last pieces of aristocratic attire she had managed to preserve during her exile, she prepared for the confrontation that would define not only Marcus Blackwood's fate, but also her own transformation from a victim seeking revenge into an instrument of genuine justice. The letter she left in Lord Harrison's chambers revealed her true identity, provided the location of additional evidence compromising Marcus, and offered personal testimony about the methods she had observed being prepared against him. More importantly, it included detailed instructions on how to protect Lady Margaret from her father's plans to exploit her. When Marcus Blackwood awoke the following morning to discover his governess had vanished and her true identity had been revealed to his enemies, he finally understood he had been living under the same roof as the ghost of his greatest victim. The realization that Lady Evangeline Ashford had orchestrated every aspect of his imminent ruin through months of careful observation and manipulation represented the complete collapse of his sense of control and security. The title that had defined his life, Duke of Ravenshollow, was about to become synonymous not with power and prestige, but with corruption and self-inflicted ruin. And the architect of his destruction had chosen justice over personal vengeance, transforming her quest for retribution into something greater and more enduring than individual satisfaction. The revelation of Miss Catherine Winters' true identity echoed through London's aristocratic circles like a political tremor that would redefine decades-old alliances. Lady Evangeline Ashford, the dead daughter of the Earl of Montclair, had returned from metaphorical death with evidence that would not only posthumously exonerate her father, but also expose a network of corruption reaching the highest echelons of government. Lord Harrison Ashford, armed with direct testimony and irrefutable documentation, mobilized family resources that had lain dormant since the Earl of Montclair's disgrace. The Ashford family, despite their recent setbacks, still maintained influential connections that had simply avoided public association during the years of controversy. Now, confronted with evidence of their kinsman's innocence and the conspiracy that had caused his death, these allies emerged with renewed strength. Evangeline established temporary residence at Lord Harrison's London estate, where she spent the first weeks after her revelation, providing detailed testimony to parliamentary investigators. Each session was a painful exhumation of memories she had tried to bury, but also a validation that her suffering would serve a purpose greater than personal revenge. The legal strategy that developed transcended the specific case against Marcus Blackwood. Investigators recognized they had a unique opportunity to expose and dismantle a system of corruption that had operated with impunity for years. Evangeline became not only a witness, but a specialized consultant on the methods employed by Marcus, providing insights that would allow them to identify other victims and similar conspiracies. Marcus Blackwood, meanwhile, did not passively accept his ruin. Recognizing he faced not only disgrace, but also imprisonment and complete loss of property, he mobilized desperate resources for a final defense. His initial maneuvers involved attempts to implicate co-conspirators in his activities, offering revelations about other powerful figures in exchange for reduced consideration of his own transgressions. This tactic created panic among established members of Parliament who had indirectly benefited from his schemes, but it also solidified support for Evangeline among those who recognized the need for systemic reform. Evangeline responded to these maneuvers through a carefully orchestrated campaign that transcended traditional political methods. Recognizing that public opinion would be decisive, she began appearing at social events where she could articulate her vision of renewed aristocratic justice. Her appearances were carefully choreographed events that demonstrated both her legitimacy as the heiress of Montclair and her moral authority as a victim who had triumphed over injustice. The most severe test of her strategy came when Marcus attempted to use Lady Margaret as a human shield in his defense. Claiming that the accusations against him were traumatizing his daughter and that investigators were violating the sanctity of the family relationship, he sought legal protections that would significantly complicate the process against him. Evangeline met this challenge with an action that demonstrated both personal courage and political acumen. She requested a private audience with Lady Margaret, supervised by court officials, but away from her father's direct influence. During this meeting, she allowed the child to express her own feelings about the situation and independently choose how she wished to proceed. Lady Margaret, demonstrating a maturity surprising for her age, decided to provide limited testimony that would corroborate specific aspects of the accusations against her father without completely compromising her family relationship. Her statement, delivered in a closed session, provided crucial independent confirmation of multiple points in the case against Marcus, while protecting her own emotional stability. Marcus's reaction to this betrayal by his own daughter revealed aspects of his character that shocked even his remaining supporters. His publicly expressed fury against a child who had simply told the truth demonstrated the moral depravity that had always motivated his actions, but which he had previously managed to hide behind aristocratic respectability. Simultaneously, Evangeline orchestrated additional revelations that maintained constant pressure on Marcus's position. Documents she had secretly copied during her time as governess continued to emerge at strategic moments, each new batch providing evidence that anticipated and neutralized defense arguments before they could be effectively presented. The turning point in the political war came when Sir Edmund Carstairs, under pressure from his own imminent exposure, revealed the location of additional files Marcus had kept on remote properties. These documents included correspondence that implicated even higher figures in the political hierarchy, creating pressure for a swift resolution of the case before the scandal expanded beyond control. Marcus, recognizing that his position had become untenable, made a last, desperate attempt to negotiate favorable terms by threatening to reveal government secrets that could compromise national security. This strategy, however, only accelerated the proceedings against him, as authorities recognized they could not allow a proven criminal to hold sensitive information as blackmail leverage. The final phase of the political war involved not only Marcus Blackwood's fate, but also the broader question of how the political system would respond to revelations of systemic corruption. Evangeline found herself at the center of debates on governmental reform, being consulted on measures that would prevent similar future abuses. Her evolution from a victim seeking revenge to a respected political reformer culminated in her appointment to a parliamentary commission, tasked with investigating and recommending systematic changes to processes that had allowed Marcus's practices. This position represented not only personal validation, but also an opportunity to ensure that her family's suffering would serve a lasting purpose of protection for others. When the formal parliamentary hearings began, Marcus Blackwood faced not only specific accusations related to the Earl of Montclair, but a comprehensive case documenting decades of systemic criminal activity. Evangeline, now publicly recognized as Lady Evangeline Ashford and the legitimate heiress of Montclair, occupied a central position in the hearings as the main prosecution witness. The new reign that emerged was not just the restoration of her personal position, but the establishment of legal precedents that would protect future generations of the aristocracy against predators like Marcus Blackwood. The alliances of blood she had forged transcended traditional family connections, creating a network of reformers committed to preserving institutional integrity. The great political war had been fought and won through principles of truth and justice, but its personal cost to Evangeline would only be measured in the subsequent years, as she confronted the emotional consequences of her complete transformation from an innocent daughter into the architect of another human being's destruction. The eve of Evangeline's final testimony at the parliamentary hearings found her in a state of deep contemplation that transcended immediate tactical considerations. In the chambers she had reclaimed at her family's London estate, she examined the documents that would definitively prove Marcus Blackwood's guilt, recognizing that each page represented not only legal evidence, but also the weight of 3 years of her life dedicated to the pursuit of justice. Marcus, confined under strict supervision, but still retaining limited privileges due to his title, had spent the preceding weeks in equally intense preparation for the final confrontation. His remaining lawyers, those who had not abandoned his cause when the extent of his culpability became undeniable, had devised a desperate strategy that relied on discrediting Evangeline through attacks on her character and questions about her motivations. The final strategy Evangeline implemented for this culminating confrontation demonstrated the political sophistication she had developed during her months of preparation and struggle. Instead of simply presenting evidence and responding to attacks, she chose to use Marcus's very presence as a tool to reveal his true nature to observers who still harbored doubts about his culpability. On the morning of the final hearings, she requested a private meeting with Lady Margaret, who had been brought to London under legal protection to provide additional testimony if necessary. The objective was not to prepare the child for specific testimony, but rather to ensure she understood that her choice to speak the truth had been valuable and necessary, regardless of the family consequences. Lady Margaret, who had visibly matured during the months of family crisis, expressed an understanding that her father had committed terrible acts against innocent people, including Evangeline herself. The child also revealed that she had observed changes in his behavior that had frightened her: outbursts of rage, threatening conversations with visitors, and a growing coldness towards her that suggested progressive moral deterioration. The final phase of the hearings began with Evangeline occupying a central position in the Grand Parliamentary Hall, aware that her appearance and composure would be scrutinized as meticulously as her words. She had chosen attire that reflected both her legitimate aristocratic standing and the sobriety appropriate to the occasion, presenting an image of dignity that deliberately contrasted with Marcus's visible nervous agitation. Evangeline's initial testimony focused not on dramatic accusations, but on a methodical narration of the events that had destroyed her family. She described her father's imprisonment, the subsequent trial based on fabricated evidence, and her own experience of losing not only a beloved relative, but also social standing and financial security. Every detail was presented with factual precision that allowed no questioning of its veracity. Marcus, observing from his position in the defendant's box, showed increasing agitation as the testimony progressed. Evangeline noticed how he alternately tried to maintain an aristocratic composure and succumbed to impulses to interrupt that revealed his deteriorating mental state. It was precisely the reaction she had anticipated and planned to exploit. Evangeline's culminating strategy involved the presentation of a document she had saved specifically for this moment, her own teenage letter pleading with Marcus for mercy for her father, along with his written reply expressing satisfaction at the opportunity to destroy the Ashford family. The juxtaposition of a concerned daughter's desperate innocence with the calculated cruelty of his response created an emotional impact that transcended technical legal considerations. It was during the reading of this correspondence that Marcus finally lost complete control. He interrupted the proceedings with an explosion of rage that revealed not only his culpability, but also a complete absence of remorse for his actions. His furious declaration that he had acted within his rights as a superior political figure, and that the consequences for families like the Ashfords were simply necessary costs of power, exposed his true moral philosophy before a shocked audience. Evangeline allowed him to complete his outburst without interruption, recognizing that he was providing more devastating evidence about his character than any external testimony could supply. When he finally exhausted himself, she responded with a calm that demonstrated superior emotional control and a moral legitimacy that no one present could question. Evangeline's final response transcended personal revenge to articulate a vision of aristocratic responsibility that resonated with the higher ideals of British political tradition. She declared that her objective had not been merely to destroy Marcus Blackwood, but rather to establish precedents that would protect future innocent families against similar predators, preserving the integrity of the institutions that had been corrupted by men like him. The final session ended with Marcus being removed under formal custody, his aristocratic composure having completely disintegrated before the irrefutable evidence of his guilt and the superior moral dignity of his primary victim. Evangeline remained in the hall after he left, surrounded by legislators who expressed admiration for her courage and determination in seeking justice through methods that honored the best traditions of her social class. That night, alone in her chambers, Evangeline confronted the realization that she had achieved more than she had ever dared to hope. Marcus Blackwood not only faced complete ruin, but his destruction had been orchestrated in a way that exposed the systemic dangers of political corruption, creating momentum for reforms that would protect future generations. The Emperor's face had been revealed as a mask hiding a predator, and the young woman he had tried to destroy had become the instrument of his own poetic justice. The final strategy had triumphed not through vengeance, but through the exposure of truth and the appeal to the highest values that legitimately governed aristocratic society. The final verdict of the parliamentary hearings was announced on a gray October morning that seemed to reflect the historical gravity of the moment. Marcus Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had been found guilty of multiple charges of conspiracy, fabrication of evidence, political corruption, and treason against the fundamental principles governing the British aristocracy. The penalties included complete loss of title and properties, imprisonment for a period of no less than 20 years, and permanent banishment from any participation in governmental affairs. Evangeline was present in the public gallery when the sentence was pronounced, observing as the man who had destroyed her family finally received the justice that had been denied to the Earl of Montclair. Marcus maintained an appearance of dignity during the formal reading, but she could see in his eyes the complete recognition that he had fatally underestimated his victim's determination and capability. The immediate reaction to the verdict revealed the extent of the political transformation the case had provoked. Members of Parliament who had initially tried to minimize the scandal now competed to express support for the systemic reforms Evangeline had advocated. Public opinion, galvanized by the revelations about systemic corruption, demanded changes that would ensure future abuses would be impossible. However, it was the final encounter between Evangeline and Marcus that provided the true emotional conclusion to her 3-year journey. Before his transfer to prison, she requested and received permission for a private visitation, supervised but allowing confidential conversation. The man she confronted in the temporary cell was vastly different from the arrogant duke she had known as a governess. Marcus, dressed in simple prisoner's clothes, had lost the aura of power that had always defined him. When Evangeline entered, he observed her with a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect, recognizing that he had been outmaneuvered by a superior adversary. The ensuing conversation was conducted with a formality that reflected their former aristocratic positions, but also with an honesty that their extreme circumstances allowed. Marcus expressed genuine curiosity about how she had orchestrated his ruin with such precision, admitting that he had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination. Evangeline responded that she had simply employed the same methods he had used against others, but with a moral motivation he had never possessed. The crucial difference was that her evidence was genuine, while his had always been fabricated. Marcus's most significant admission came when he acknowledged that he had destroyed the Ashford family, not out of political necessity, but out of personal arrogance. The Earl of Montclair had represented a type of aristocratic integrity that, by contrast, exposed Marcus's corruption, making him a threat that needed to be eliminated, even in the absence of direct conflict between them. Evangeline replied that this revelation confirmed that her quest for justice had transcended personal revenge to become a defense of principles that legitimately governed her social class. She had not sought merely to destroy Marcus, but rather to protect others from the predation he represented, and to establish precedents that would prevent future abuses. The most emotional moment of the confrontation came when Marcus inquired about Lady Margaret's fate. Evangeline assured him that she had arranged for the child to be raised by distant relatives who would provide her with an appropriate education away from the infamy associated with the Blackwood name. More importantly, she had established a trust fund that would ensure the girl's financial independence when she reached adulthood. Marcus showed genuine emotion for the first time during the entire conversation, as he expressed gratitude for the consideration shown to his daughter. Evangeline responded that Lady Margaret was innocent of her father's transgressions and deserved an opportunity to build an honorable life independent of her family heritage. This consideration for the innocent child fundamentally differentiated her approach from the cruelty Marcus had demonstrated against entire families. The final conversation focused on the historical legacy their confrontations would leave for future generations. Marcus recognized that he would be remembered as an example of aristocratic corruption, while Evangeline had established herself as a model of how victims of injustice could seek redress through methods that honored the best traditions of their social class. Evangeline observed that the true judgment of history would not be determined solely by her victory over Marcus, but by the effectiveness of the reforms her case had inspired. If future families were protected against similar predators, then her father's suffering and her own journey would have served a lasting purpose that transcended personal satisfaction. As she left the prison, Evangeline carried a sense of completeness she had sought during 3 years of preparation and struggle. Marcus Blackwood would face the consequences of his actions. Lady Margaret would have an opportunity for an honorable life, and the political system had been forced to confront its own vulnerabilities to corruption. The judgment of history, however, would be determined by the subsequent years, when it would become clear whether the lessons learned through the Blackwood case would result in lasting protections for aristocratic integrity, or simply represent an isolated victory against a particularly arrogant predator. That night, alone in her restored chambers at the family estate, Lady Evangeline Ashford contemplated the fact that she had recovered not only her name and position, but also a sense of purpose that transcended her personal circumstances. The young woman who had arrived in Ravenshollow consumed by a desire for revenge had evolved into a respected political figure committed to systemic justice. The great confrontation had ended, but her true victory would be measured by her ability to transform personal tragedy into a force for positive change that would protect future generations of the British aristocracy against the corruption Marcus Blackwood had represented. 5 years after the trial that sealed Marcus Blackwood's fate, Lady Evangeline Ashford gazed upon the restored gardens of the ancestral Montclair estate during a golden spring morning that symbolized the complete renewal of her life and family legacy. The reforms implemented by Parliament in response to the revelations of her case had become a permanent part of the British legal structure, creating protections that had already prevented multiple attempts at similar corruption. The estate she now managed had been completely restored through government reparations and restitution of assets unjustly confiscated during her father's persecution. More significant than the material recovery, however, was the restoration of family honor. The Earl of Montclair had been posthumously exonerated of all charges, and his name had been inscribed in a parliamentary memorial honoring victims of political injustice. Lady Margaret Blackwood, now 17 and bearing the adopted surname of Pemberton in honor of the governess who had cared for her during the most turbulent periods, had become a frequent visitor to Montclair. The young woman, educated away from the infamy associated with her biological father, had developed into a woman of remarkable character who maintained regular correspondence with Evangeline about her studies and future aspirations. The relationship between them had evolved beyond the traumatic circumstances of their first encounter to become a genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared goals. Margaret had expressed interest in pursuing a legal career focused on social reform. Inspired by the example of how Evangeline had transformed personal injustice into a force for systemic change, Evangeline's most recent project involved establishing an educational institute dedicated to training young aristocrats in principles of ethical governance and social responsibility. The institution, funded through recovered funds from Marcus Blackwood's confiscated properties, would be a living memorial to the values her father had represented and that she had defended during her fight for justice. Marcus Blackwood himself had survived only 3 years in prison, succumbing to an illness that many observers attributed to the shock of his complete fall from absolute power to total impotence. His death had been noted in the newspapers as an appropriate conclusion to a life dedicated to the exploitation of others. But Evangeline had felt only sadness for the human degradation his ruin represented. The institute she founded would include a library containing complete documentation of the Blackwood case, serving as an educational resource for future generations on the dangers of political corruption and the effective methods to combat it. Students would learn not only about the specific crimes Marcus had committed, but also about the moral principles that had motivated his exposure and punishment. Evangeline's political influence had grown substantially in the years subsequent to the trial. She had been appointed to multiple parliamentary commissions related to social reform and had become a respected advisor on issues involving governmental integrity. Her opinion was frequently sought on cases involving potential corruption, and her approval had become virtually essential for the credibility of reform initiatives. More personally significant, she had found the possibility of a romantic relationship with Lord James Worthington, a political reformer who shared her values and had consistently supported her efforts during the years of struggle. The courtship developing between them was based on intellectual respect and moral compatibility that promised a solid foundation for a lasting partnership. The correspondence she maintained with other families who had suffered similar injustices revealed that her case had inspired multiple investigations that resulted in reparations and additional reforms. The legal precedent established through her victory against Marcus had been successfully invoked in at least 12 subsequent cases, validating her belief that individual justice could catalyze systemic change. The title of Earl of Montclair, which she had inherited after her father's posthumous exoneration, now carried connotations of moral integrity that transcended its traditional historical associations. The Ashford name had become synonymous with resistance against corruption and defense of genuine aristocratic values, creating a legacy that would influence future generations. During moments of reflection like this golden morning, Evangeline recognized that her journey of revenge had transformed into something much greater than personal satisfaction. The young woman who had returned as a governess to destroy Marcus Blackwood had discovered that true victory came not from the destruction of enemies, but from the construction of systems that would protect others from similar suffering. The eternal echo of her title would resonate not only through the restoration of family honor, but through the institutions and precedents that would ensure future generations of the British aristocracy would be protected against predators like Marcus Blackwood. Her transformation from victim to reformer had created a legacy that would transcend her own mortality. The letters that regularly arrived from families who had benefited from the reforms inspired by her case served as a constant reminder that genuine justice multiplied its effects through time, creating waves of protection and security that extended far beyond the original circumstances that had motivated them. As she watched Margaret Pemberton, the young woman who had been Lady Margaret Blackwood, approach through the gardens for another of her regular visits, Evangeline contemplated the fact that even the children of predators could transcend their origins when offered appropriate examples of moral integrity and possibilities of redemption. The new kingdom she had established was governed not by vengeance or power, but by the eternal principles of justice, responsibility, and protection of the innocent that defined true nobility. Lady Evangeline Ashford, Earl of Montclair, had discovered that true victory over injustice came through the creation of lasting legacies that would prevent the repetition of the tragedies that had motivated her original struggle.